Hey guys, how's everybody doing? So look, I thought that maybe I would attempt to teach. How about that? Wouldn't that be nice? Basically what I wanted to do here today is I'm putting together a video that is just going to go over Chapter 9, Section 1. Basically, America is established. We have a Constitution. We have a Bill of Rights. We have 3 branches of government. We are ready to roll with George Washington pictured here in the image that you see here. He's got his hand on the Bible. His right hand is on the Bible as he's taking his oath of office. This is the inauguration of George Washington as the very first president of the United States. And as we go through this, I want you guys to just sort of put in your head that Washington is going to set the stage for future presidents. He sets the precedent for the president. You like how I did just there? That's pretty good, right? We're also going to try to figure out what exactly is the Supreme Court. What do they do? We're going to talk a little bit about Washington's position about politics in America and how he actually ruined this country. It's a little tongue-in-cheek, but just something that I want you guys to be aware of. Hopefully, if you guys have done the homework, you guys have read the section, you know a little bit about Hamilton's plan for the economy, and a little bit of a trivia, you know, Mr. Irvine style, what does French underwear have to do with America's economy? Finally, last but not least, the Whiskey Rebellion. Hopefully you guys vaguely remember a little bit about Shays' Rebellion. Shays' Rebellion, they were the farmers from Massachusetts who served in the American Revolution, came home to find that their property was being taxed. So, let's kind of get right into this. As you guys are looking here, this is basically your very first Supreme Court. You had John Marshall being your very first Chief Justice and 4 associate justices as well on that very first Supreme Court. That was the Judiciary Act that established that. Washington passed that in 1789, and he basically says we are going to have 5 justices. This also creates a system of district courts and circuit courts all over the country. And we set up a process that if a lower court had a decision, that decision could be appealed up to a higher court and potentially going all the way to the Supreme Court. All of this sounds very official, but the reality is the Supreme Court guys, I want you to kind of picture, they're the dudes over sitting on the bench going, yeah, that's nice, but what exactly are we supposed to do? And we'll get into that. Don't worry, but I want you to just kind of be aware they're a third power of the United States government, and they're kind of just sitting on their hands on the bench. Going through this, I want you to realize this is George Washington's cabinet that you see here. You had Henry Knox, who was a hero of the American Revolution, the Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton. Perhaps you've heard something about the Broadway play. Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson, who will become the 3rd President of the United States. You had Edmund Randolph there as well. And of course, Washington's Vice President was Adams. So Washington goes through, and what he does, it's an amazing thing. Washington did not want to be surrounded by yes men. He didn't want to be surrounded by people who told him, oh, you're so intelligent, Mr. Washington. He wanted to hear opinions from all angles. He wanted to hear arguments from both sides. So he filled his cabinet with people who came to issues from different points of view. He wanted that. He filled his cabinet with men with very different ideas. Washington also really hated political parties. He had seen what political parties had done in England. He saw how they had divided the people. And actually, one of the things that you guys had to define for me was his farewell address, and he warned them, do not allow politics to get established here. It will ruin this country. Ironically, it's Washington himself who creates political parties here. What he did when he filled his cabinet with men with different political ideas, that sounds like a brilliant move, and we do applaud him for not surrounding him by men who just told him how smart he was. He filled his cabinet with people who said black and with people who said white. When Washington finally steps down after serving 2 terms as president, the people in America go, oh, okay, well, who's going to be our next president? And naturally, they look to his cabinet. They look at his cabinet and go, these are the guys who are closest to Washington. These are the guys who know what it takes to run the country. So we should probably pick from someone in the cabinet. But remember, Washington had picked men with such different views that when it came down to who would lead us, men like Adams and Hamilton had very, very different ideas than, say, Jefferson. All right, so let's jump into Hamilton's plan, okay? Hamilton is George Washington's right-hand man in the American Revolution. He is going to appoint him as Secretary of the Treasury. Washington does, Hamilton, and Hamilton comes up with this plan to try to get America fired up and moving. His plan had three parts. First, any bonds that had been issued during the Revolution and just shortly thereafter the Revolution, America would buy up. They would then sell brand new bonds to pay off the debt that they had accrued during the Revolution and buying of the bonds. And he figured, listen, we'll have a longer time as bonds slowly mature. America's economy will improve, the federal government will have more money, and we will be able to pay off those bonds through a national bank. It doesn't sound all that complicated, but the problem was that Hamilton's plan allowed very, very, very wealthy men to go to people who didn't have quite so much money. Let's say they were holding a bond for $100, and at the time that bond was only maybe worth $60. That rich man would go in and say, look, I'll offer you $65 for your $60 bond. It hasn't matured yet. The poorer folk, needing the money, sold their bond that was at that time worth $60 for $65, and hey, they made $5 extra. The problem was then when America buys up all the old bonds, the very, very wealthy men get paid the full maturity amount for that bond. It's one of those stories about the rich just keep getting richer. And the poor don't necessarily get poorer, but they don't get as wealthy. So let's start talking about Washington's cabinet here. You have Hamilton, who is a Federalist. That's the dude all the way down there on the left. Hamilton's from New York or the North. And you have Jefferson. Jefferson is a Democratic Republican. And when they were creating the Constitution, Jefferson would have been an anti-Federalist, a guy who was kind of afraid of the Constitution. Looking at Hamilton, Hamilton likes big business. Large economy. Basically, the wealthy have the most say, and they should. They were probably the best educated. That was Hamilton's plan. Hamilton didn't think that folks like you and I should be able to vote. We were not educated enough, properly enough, to have say. Jefferson, on the other hand, favors the farmer, the hard-working man, the blue-collar economy. He said they are the true backbone of America. Hamilton hated the French Revolution. He said, since the French king was killed during the French Revolution, though we had signed a treaty with them, the French people killed their French king, so that treaty is null and void. Jefferson, on the other hand, fully supported the French Revolution. He didn't like how bloody it got. He didn't like how violent it got, but he supported the people's right to do whatever was necessary. And he said they helped us in our own revolution. Hamilton said poorer folk wouldn't be robbed under his plan. They were free to sell their bonds at any time. If rich people bought them up for profit, the poor were still going to make more money than they had in their pockets already. Remember, that bond was worth $60, but they were selling it for $65, so they actually made more money than it was worth. But Jefferson said, Hamilton's plan favors the rich, allowing the rich to buy up the bonds at a cheaper price and then sell them to the federal government for profit. So the fight is going to begin. Basically, you have two opinions brewing already. Yes, in America's infancy, we have a division, North versus South. In the North, they loved Hamilton's plan because they were giving their debt to the federal government. The North was in deep financial debt. Hamilton creates tariffs on imported goods, forcing Americans to buy from home instead of importing goods from overseas. Now, the South hated the plan. Many of the southern states had paid off their war debt, and they said, why in the world should we help to pay the North debts? The South owned very few industries. They were an agrarian community or economy. They were based pretty much on farming. So Now these farmers are forced to buy produced goods from companies in the north or pay very high tariffs to import stuff from other countries. So here's that little trivia twister that I gave you. This is what colonial underwear looked like back then. Many Americans had been buying their underwear from France because it was a softer, more comfortable fabric. There were American companies that made underwear, but it wasn't as soft or comfortable to wear. Under Hamilton's plan, for example, you could buy American underwear, thereby supporting an American business. Or you could continue to buy your underwear from France, but you had to pay a very high tariff. It's like a tax, and that tax goes directly to the federal government. Either way, America wins, unless you make the other country mad. And you may remember, not too long ago, President Trump did this with steel and China. China makes steel. It is inferior. It is not as good as American steel, but it is very, very cheap. And a lot of American companies were building with Chinese steel. Trump went into a trade war with China and said, I am going to put very high tariffs on Chinese steel. If American companies still want to buy Chinese steel, they're going to pay a lot of money and it's going to come to the American Treasury for them to get it. Or they could save money and support an American steel company. So there had to be a compromise. Hamilton was able to pass his plan, but it took quite a bit of wrangling. The South felt like no one was listening to them and their worries about the infant country, so Hamilton offers to move the nation's capital further south. If you remember, the nation's capital at this time was in New York, and they said, the South was not being listened to, so they said, well, why don't we put the nation's capital further south? It won't be ignored then. So they agreed to move it to temporarily in Philadelphia, as they began construction in Washington, D.C., which basically was a territory between Virginia and Maryland. Just as it looks like America is about to get rolling, a little rebellion breaks out, though, because of Hamilton's economic plan. Hamilton had decided to tax whiskey. Whiskey comes from corn, and a lot of farmers, especially in the West, were finding it difficult to transport corn and ship it to the coast before corn had rotted, spoiled, or began to mold and mildew. However, if you convert it to a liquid, then you could put it in a barrel and ship it, and you didn't have to worry about it rotting. Farmers living near Pittsburgh were the most vocal in their opposition, though, even though there were other places in Kentucky that were in open rebellion as well. Hamilton's plan cut a big break to big distributors of whiskey. Basically, if you were rich, and let's say these are just, numbers that I'm making up here, it's what I do, but if you were producing 1,000 gallons of whiskey a week, you were charged 3 cents per gallon produced in tax. But if you were just small time, if you were just a little guy, and you were producing, let's say, less than 1,000 gallons a week, you're charged 5 cents a gallon. So the little guy is feeling frustrated, saying, are you kidding me? Why am I paying higher rates? Look, here's another example of the rich getting cut breaks. But when you add up the money, really, these rich distributors, these large distributors, were actually paying much, much more in total taxes. So just want you guys to see, okay? What winds up happening is Washington is very upset about this little rebellion going on, so he takes this threat to his presidency and the infant republic seriously. He comes out of retirement, and both he and Alexander Hamilton, who had also retired, mount up just as they had done in the American Revolution and lead 1,300 troops against these rebels in Pennsylvania. It is the only time in American history that a sitting president leads troops into a military conflict. The only time. And the ironic thing is that when these rebels see these troops coming, they're going to sit there and fight until the very end, but when they realize that George Washington is leading them, not a single one of them is willing to take a shot at the father of our country. They all surrender. Washington issues all of them pardons except for a handful of men who serve a very small sentence. So basically, guys, when you compare this to Shays' Rebellion, and the Whiskey Rebellion. Shays' Rebellion went off without any way for the federal government to stop it. If you remember, Congress was going, well, we'd like to step in, but we don't have any power because they were created under the Articles of Confederation. Now that we are operating under the Constitution, Washington is very concerned about the security of the country, and he realizes, dang, you know, these little rebels are about to bust off everything that we've done, so I'm going to go in and put a stop to this ridiculousness. And he does. The Constitution is the big dog, man. It tells us that the federal government has real, true power. They are not just a paper tiger like they had been under the Articles of Confederation. So, we're already pushing 16 minutes, guys. I just thought that I would put this little thing together for you guys now. Hopefully it makes a little more sense. Chapter 9, Section 1, there's a quick little review for you. Look for Chapter 9, Section 2 in the next day or so. All right. Take care.